Hello, I'm back this Monday afternoon. I seem to be in a roll full of ideas lately, so here we go with another little clip. And today I wanted to talk about an experience that I had during this weekend, which was simultaneously a kind of opening of the heart center, uh, combined with what you could call shadow work, or willingly going into a trauma that feels unresolved, and uh, trying to willingly hold that pain, that somatic sensation, and those memories in consciousness while remaining with as much equanimity and presence as you can, essentially. So a number of now, before I get all distant about the experience, let's start with the most significant part, which is it was very intense. It was very unpleasant, very necessary, very fruitful, very insightful. But it wasn't easy, and it almost feels like no. So it was a difficult experience. Actually it feels like my heart center is still tender from the exercise, if you could say that, because in order to resolve that past trauma that I felt needed to be processed, still probably needs a bit of processing, I needed to reopen it fully, and actually re-experience it as if it had happened that very day. So this took place between Saturday and Sunday, and what's amazing to me is just how vivid the pain was and how vivid the memories became. Memories that I hadn't thought of for years, in fact, all bubbled to the surface together with that somatic, very, very deep pain in the heart. And I can't claim that I stayed equanimous the whole way around. And part of that was because I wanted to trigger it. I wanted to trigger a kind of cathartic release in which I could fully experience that and let it play out and just let it sort of flow through. Now, I didn't completely lose my marbles either, and I can claim that despite of how unpleasant this was, and it lasted for about a day and a half, that during the episodes in between emotional release that were taking place, I was able to return to full neutrality. Even though there was a lot of unpleasantness and anxiety, I was a high degree of conscious awareness was in me. I could really observe it in a fairly, or at least partially detached way, and with a fair amount of equanimity. So it didn't throw me off balance. It didn't throw my life into a negative spin or anything along those lines. I feel that I felt that I was not a victim to a situation, but rather able to endure a very unpleasant process. Yeah, and in retrospect, it is almost as if all the mindfulness and meditation and mind-body work that I've been doing in the form of Tai Chi for the past few months and years has made it so that I can voluntarily go into the resolution of things that are clearly in the background, pulling me left and right, almost like emotional hooks that pull at you and that turn you kind of into a puppet that reacts and responds to things without too much free will, if you will. So one of the things that occurred to me as this was happening, and thinking about that willingness and readiness to go into hardcore shadow work of this kind, is this idea of how over time your spiritual practice and your mindful or meditation practice prepares you so that you can start the real work of going into the muck, right? Like really going into the trauma, into the areas of the ego that you've been denying to yourself, and brushing off, or just postponing, or seeking for entertainment so that this can stay dampened. And so I started to almost imagine how so I made this clip a little while ago. I should even, in fact, try to look for the name, become a real YouTuber that says, if you're interested more, see my clip about. So yeah, so I made a clip. It's called How You Store and Clear Trauma. And then the subtitle to that was What Creates Trauma and How to Remove It Skillfully. Okay, so in that video, one of the things that I was talking about was how when your system knows that it doesn't have the resources to deal with a traumatic situation that is happening, it instead of keeping it out in the open where you can see it clearly, it kind of hides it from you, and it hides it in the mind body. So it's stored somewhere in your physical system, but there's of course a mental connection to that place. So that mind body place becomes a little knot. It becomes a kink in the hose, and we have lots of them, especially in this area here. And so it stores it, and it keeps it there until the moment where it feels like, you know what, I think I can deal with this now, and then things start to bubble up. Now, that knot will be continuously sending messages that something is unresolved, right? That's where a lot of chronic illnesses come from. That's where burnouts and things like that come from. That's when unpleasant behaviors and addictions come from. It's from these unresolved things that keep trying to manifest, but we, or our system, keeps trying to suppress them because it somehow inherently knows that it isn't ready to deal with them, because the ripples that they could send through our life are too much for us to manage. So what got me thinking is how a lot of the mind body bodily awareness and sort of integrative work that we do through things like Tai Chi and meditation, what they start to do is they start to create a structure in us that is very well knit together, that is highly connected. I may have mentioned in the past this concept of tensegrity, right? It's a tensegrity structure is one that where all the different points in the structure are so well, fairly lightly, but very tightly knit across each other, so that if one of those connections was to be lost, it wouldn't unravel the entire thing, right? So that structure has tensegrity, and it has a lot of integrity, therefore. And so it takes a lot more than a couple of things going wrong for the structure to dismantle. And it occurred to me that as we do, the more mind-body work we do, our mind-body system begins to acquire this kind of tensegrity of its own, right? Things start to become very well connected, and there comes a well-connectedness point at which the system realizes that it is more resilient than it was in the past. And it is well documented. I've spoken about the book Mindsight in the past, and it is well documented that systems and minds that are poorly integrated, they tend to chaos and stagnation simultaneously, whereas systems that are well integrated, they tend to acquire flow, but they are also systems that are, I wouldn't say risk prone, but rather drawn to challenge, as opposed to withdrawing, right? Like a system that withdraws from life and withdraws from challenge. When the system feels strong, it embraces and is drawn to life and drawn to challenge. And therefore, the system seems to inherently know how strong it is. So that, and so the way I started imagining this was to say that, therefore, when you start to do, let's take a step back. That there is a time to engage in what you could call shadow work or trauma resolution, right? Like all these somatic knots that have been stored until you are ready to address them. There is a time to do that. If you go into that too early, if you force that through aggressive practices like these sort of very you could name holotropic breathwork sessions, for example, which can be quite energizing and bring a lot of these things up, but they need a lot of facilitation. You could imagine talking about psychedelics, which are a lot in fashion. These are practices that bring you to highly energized, deeply somatic states in which your unconscious sort of gets opened. But not that this is the norm, because I have done holotropic breathwork, and in fact there's a few sessions that I've taped on my channel, and the same goes for psychedelics. And my experiences have been very healing and fantastic. But there is accounts of people who, have psychotic breakdowns, or who fail to be able to put their life together after that event. This is one of the dangers that I see in the current format of Vipassana retreats, in which complete newbies are put into 11 hours of meditation for 10 days straight. And the system becomes energized to a point where you can have a psychotic break. There might be things that pop up which your system has not been prepped to contain, right? And so it speaking of containing, and that's kind of the punchline to this story that I wanted to build up to, or rather towards which I wanted to build, because you don't end sentences in a preposition. The idea is that the more mind-body work you do, what you can then create when your system has the tensegrity and the integration, and it is a well integrated and strong system, you can then start to create controlled explosions inside, and because you know and you feel that it will be a controlled explosion, right? So it's almost like these robots that go about detonating mines in a minefield, or things of that kind, or you detect a suspicious object in the airport, and it's got a timer and it's ticking, right? And so maybe what they'll do is they'll cover it in lead plates or whatever, and then blow it up on purpose, right? So it'll be a controlled explosion, and that's the best that you can have, as a matter of fact. Now, even better than that is no explosion at all, right? Like that would be ideal for the trauma to just dissolve and resolve. In my experience, that happens a lot with minor nuisance type of things, but for deep trauma, it's more likely that there's a cathartic release that needs to take place of one type or another. But you want that cathartic release, you want that explosion to be contained by a mind-body system that has been developed and strengthened over time, so that it's so well integrated that explosion doesn't just turn the thing apart. And part of the thing that makes it that an uncontrolled trauma release explosion could bring your system to pieces is the fact that that some of the or probably most of the heavy trauma that you've incurred in life ties into trauma that is inherited from what you could call the collective unconscious, right? What I mean to say by that is somewhere in the Paleolithic, your great, to the 10th degree grand ancestor, maybe some sort of little rodent, hominid, little looking creature, got chased around in a horrific way and almost died, and kind of lost a leg but still managed to sort of, pass on its genes, and the next one after that, and then wars and things. And all those things are embedded in your amygdala and in your fear and panic and heart center, right? So that deep trauma tends to be related to things that are not unique to you as a person and to the story in your life that delivered that trauma, but it tends to be related to things like parental abandonment, right? Or parental non-recognition, or being sort of derided by a parent. They may have to do with unrequited love, or being abandoned by a partner. Maybe it has to do with serious doubts about your abilities to be successful and make a living, and therefore, fear of loneliness or poverty, right? It may have to do with fear of dying, right? Have an illness, you're afraid to die. So the deep trauma is tied to reproductive and survival and tribal or familiar acceptance strands in your heart and your mind that go to the very core of what it means to be human. And so when these things are poked by an event in your life that really drives it home, they go all the way down, right? So this is not superficial trauma, but it's like it touches the very, very fibers of the physical heart, because it hurts. Like the physical heart actually contracts and suffers from lesions and knots and things of that kind, right? And so this is not a trivial matter, and the likelihood that this thing will be resolved by its own is very, very unlikely. So the very best that you can hope for is a contained explosion, and to that degree, I would almost start to compare spiritual gurus and mindful coaches as kind of demolition men, if you want to think of it that way, right? So these are people who are not just gonna throw a bomb at the building and watch it just become a mess, but they will place charges in very educated ways so that things fall into place in a controlled way. So the release of trauma and shadow work is a controlled demolition, is a controlled explosion, like I said. And you ought to treat it as such. You ought to treat it with care. You ought to treat it with respect. This is not pleasant. It's not light work, and yet it's very necessary. And I would almost go as far as saying that unless you have engaged, or eventually do engage in trauma resolution and shadow work, you haven't really done any real spiritual work to speak of. You've done practices that calm you down, make you relaxed. You go about happy-go-lucky and whatever. But the old traumas are hooks in your psyche that keep pulling you left, right, and center without you even knowing about it. So you got to have that willingness to go in there and address these things head on. Once you start to feel, as I have in the past few weeks and months, that my system has become progressively more resilient and therefore willing to go into these places. That's another interesting one. Willingness is not even enough. You may go like, what, bring it on, motherfucker, right? Like, I'm ready, and come on, is that all you got and stuff? But actually, teasing trauma out is a skill in and of itself. It doesn't just voluntarily come out. You need to go into deep states of meditation or find ways to trigger it out. It's almost like a job of midwifery. Like there's a midwife, doesn't just yank out the baby or stuff. It's like, needs to know what she's doing. So you need to almost become a midwife that teases the trauma out, and once it's there, then you bring the mindfulness, but you at the same time, you don't want to repress it with mindfulness. You need to let it flow and play itself out. It's a beautiful experience. It has, in this single one time, it has almost completely dismantled my a certain self-image or things that I was unwilling to admit about myself. Because the ego, funny enough, and that's another reason that being ready for this is very important. When you pull at one strand of the ego, the entire thing collapses, right? Because it's all a house of cards, all of it, right? So you can't move a damn thing. That's why the ego is so protective, because it knows it's fake, and it knows that it's brittle. So it goes like this all the time, and it's easily poked and easily irritated and very defensive and very aggressive. It is all a sign that whenever you find yourself being defensive or aggressive, realize that you are protecting something that's brittle and that is also fake. And so when you go into trauma resolution, the first thing your ego will try to do is go like, yeah, but that wasn't my fault. So and so did this. They betrayed my trust. So and so is a real asshole. Or my parents had no clue what they were doing, and they did this and they did that. All that stuff. And the reason for that defensiveness and that projection, so the ego will do two things to defend itself. It'll either somatize, in other words, store in the body and flare emotions in the body, or it will project. So whenever you are either somatizing or projecting and saying it was their fault, know that the ego is at work. Because it knows that one little poke in the right place at the ego, and the entire house of cards of the ego dismantles. So in this particular session, I realized a number of things about myself that are very disconcerting, very unpleasant to acknowledge. They have been ruling my life for a very, very long time, and it was bloody time that I acknowledged them, and it stings. It's just like it hurts so badly, and that's what I was trying to protect and avoid. That pain, not so much of the event, but of the of my shortcomings and the things that led to that event, and that led to not acknowledging the real reasons for certain things in my life, or a number of things. So now, boom, it blows open with a single instance of a traumatic event, and it becomes just in your face, right? So you come full circle from being defensive to letting the cathartic unpleasantness just explode, and still wishing that it wouldn't have happened, or this and that, or whatever. And then you calm down and you use the equanimity, and with that equanimity comes the ability and the willingness to go, okay, what was really happening here? Let's evaluate and acknowledge and recognize my part in this, and which were the shortcomings of my personality, and the inadequacies and the so I said shortcoming, inadequacy. What else is there to say? Yeah, I guess that's it, right? Like the inadequacies of the ego, which are an inherent part of the ego. In other words, not something to be solved, but something to be just recognized, that the ego is a dysfunctional entity, and therefore inadequate, and just damaged by definition, so to speak. And so you recognize all that, and you pull yourself away from identifying with that entity. And it is that disidentification that allows you to bear the pain, so to speak, of seeing it. And I think that brings you also closer, not to the death of the ego, but to the permeability of the ego as an entity that can help you function in the world, but that no longer drives your sense of self and your sense of identity. So so that was a little talk about shadow work, a talk about trauma resolution, willingness, and readiness, or rather the other way around, readiness and then willingness to go into it, the skill to tease it out, and how deep trauma and its resolution should be approached with caution, with respect, with love, with a lot of compassion for yourself, and with the understanding that it has almost certainly the potential, as it resolves, to show you elements of your ego that you've been unwilling to recognize, and that therefore it is the equivalent of a controlled explosion that is best approached with the help of a demolition man or a demolition expert. And if you think that you're ready with the approach that you would with a controlled explosion, which is surrounding it with a tensegrity structure or enough resilience that has been prepared in order to bear the blunt of essentially re-traumatizing yourself, except that this time around you have the power and you have the full backing and the sheer light of pure conscious awareness, which always carries the day, which always has your back, which is your real self, the real it inside, and which cannot but illuminate areas that need the light, and from these areas, from this work in the muck, in the mud, in the ugliness and the worst parts of you, that is the mud and the clay from which the lotus flower of the Buddha then arises and brings love to the world, because it has had the willingness to go into its deepest pain, and therefore is no longer afraid of it or driven by it. So I hope that makes sense. I hope help someone out there, and I'll be back with more. Cheers. Bye.